Now today, in part 2 of Preparing Him Room of our Advent series, we will look at the second necessary step and how to prepare well. So if the first step is to wait, which results in the humbling of our hearts, step 2 is to listen. Now there's a difference between hearing and listening, right? All the parents in the room said amen. There's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is when we're able to physically register that there's sound in our environment. Hearing may even extend to translating those sounds into some kind of meaning. Listening, however, occurs when we take the words to heart. And you might even say, well, yeah, I want to walk on what I hear. I want to act on what God is saying. Okay, yeah, we keep saying this. I want to listen. But then a follow-up thought sneaks in. I just wish God would speak to me. I want to listen. I want to hear him. I just wish he spoke to me. And I want to take a moment to unpack this statement today as we enter the second step of preparing him room. If we're saying it is to listen and to listen well, and the pushback our minds come to is, well, I want him to speak. Sure, I'll listen, but speak to me, God. I want to take time today to just really unpack this statement because I believe there's something behind this statement. If I'm honest, and perhaps you've experienced this too, when we reflect on this idea that we wish God would speak to us, what we might discover is that there's an assumption that's lurking beneath it and behind it. And the assumption is this: what we want to hear from God often reflects what we want most in the moment. Instead of truly listening to what God is inviting me to hear, I can find myself longing for him to fulfill a wish, meet a need, or provide for my desires, aligning his voice to my desires, to my expectations. Thomas Merton, I'm going to mix a little bit of metaphors here, author and monk, commented on the difference between hearing or listening and looking and seeing in this way. He said, when we look, we have something in mind that we want to see. We made up our mind about what we believe we need and only look for it. What Merton makes so perfectly clear for us is that we have a preferred answer we want God to speak to us. We have made up our minds about what it will sound like if God speaks to us. And of course, the challenge of this is that when he does speak to us and it doesn't match up with our expectations or our desires, we ignore him or believe he hasn't spoken to us. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 to 8, there's a phrase that is repeated a few times throughout the chapter, and it says this: today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Whoa, harden my heart? Of course I wouldn't. I just wish God would speak to me. Yet the author of Hebrews is reminding us that God will speak and does speak. The real question is, will we hear him when our hearts and desires don't align with his voice? Friends, this is not just like a throwaway statement by some ancient people who surely are not like us. No, the author is reminding us and helping us see that hearing through the lens of our desires, our wishes, our perspective, and our prejudice will cloud our ability to hear God. Our hearts may not have any room for the ways of God, let alone God himself. Our hearts may be too full with our own expectations and desires in the way life should be. And maybe more strikingly, what the author of Hebrews is saying is that we may actually harden our hearts to his message. Yeah, I see, God, you're saying this, but I want life like this. I guess you're not speaking to me because I want life like this. But in this Advent season, preparing him room begins with waiting. A waiting that humbles our hearts. Then in humility, we're invited to listen, to prepare him room. And when we listen, we realize that God is always speaking, even in his silence. And he's always at work, even when even in unexpected ways. Therefore, when we approach every moment in life as an opportunity for God to speak, teach, and lead us, we begin to create space. We begin to create space in our hearts to truly hear him. A space that creates him room to soften our hearts. If waiting was humbling our hearts, listening well begins to soften our hearts, to hear him and his love for us and the world. This listening begins to chip away at the hardness and expectations and desires we might have built in our hearts. It softens our hearts. But when we fail to make space to listen, we might understand in theory that God is at work in all things. We may even say it, but we miss the opportunity truly to be open to what he says. As a result, we may struggle to recognize each circumstance as God speaking to us. Friends, the opposite of gratitude is not ingratitude, it's entitlement. My heart for years carried entitlement. I will hear none of what you're saying. Here's how I understand God to work. And with entitlement, God is a means to an end. Yet with gratitude, God is the end, the goal, the prize. Which is why waiting and listening is key parts of creating room in our hearts. This listening allows us to examine what has been stirring and pulling our desires, to truly examine if our posture and desires are simply to use God as a means to an end we desire, or if he is our goal, our end, the one we are preparing room for. So today, when you go home, I know there'll be lots of things to do. There'll be lots of busyness, and there's probably a whole bunch of plans you have for Sunday, and you need to do them before Monday. But sometime today, whether it's before bed or whether it's in the middle of the afternoon, somewhere in your schedule, can I invite you to create some space where you can be alone, where you can wait, where you can be quiet, and you can begin listening and listen to God. And your mind will wander, and you'll go, oh, it's so hard to focus. And that's okay. Let it wander, but then just gently bring it back and keep listening to God. But today, I want to give you one more help as you're listening. Today, I'm going to be very particular and specific as you're listening. In your listening, listen to God's voice as it relates to your desires. As you sit there quietly and as you listen, see where your desires begin to stir and pull you, and bring God into that conversation. God, is what I'm desiring, is what I'm wanting, am I using you as a means to get that? Invite him into that conversation. See what God brings up into your heart, into your mind. What are the desires that are pulling at you? Are you desiring an end which ends with the prize and the goal, which is God himself, to create room for him, to soften your hearts, to renew you? Or are you asking God to fulfill some wish? So in your listening and waiting today, can I invite you to listen to God specifically as it involves to your desires? And as you're confronted with a voice, if it's entitlement, invite God to soften that desire, to speak into it, so that when you hear his voice, you may not harden your heart.